John chapter 5, sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. And there is in Jerusalem, near the sheep gate, a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by it has 5 porches. That's why it's called Bethesda. Now, it's another one? Yeah, okay. Here are a great number of disabled people. I've been to Israel, by the way, and that pool's still there. Doesn't function. But it's a great number of disabled people would go down to that pool. And tradition says that the water would begin to stir, and the first person into the water would be healed. So Jesus comes up, and there was one man there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool. When the water is stirred, while I am trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me. I'm never first." Then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." Now I want to tell you that on the surface, when you realize that Jesus was at the pool of Bethesda, he knew this man had been crippled for 38 years. He was at the healing pool. But Jesus asked him, "Do you want to be well?" Doesn't that sound like a foolish question? You ask somebody in a restaurant, "You want something to eat?" But Jesus didn't ask foolish questions. And Jesus knew his time frame was limited. He didn't have time to ask things that didn't matter. So why did Jesus ask this man, who he knew had been in this condition for a long time and was at the healing pool, if he wanted to be healed? Well, I'm going to tell you 3 reasons this morning why I think that question is not foolish. Remember now that Jesus created you and me, and he knows us better than we know ourselves. And knowing that, Jesus knows that we have the ability to enjoy our infirmities. Now, there's somebody this morning that you could think of that if you meet them on the street and you slip up and ask them how they're doing, you better have a lot of time on your hands, because they're going to tell you. Did I tell you about my knee? They're going to tell you every ache and pain they got. And if you meet them 3 times a day and ask that, they'll tell you every 3 times. They like to talk about that. If you don't believe that's true, after the service today, if you get 4 or 5 people standing around, you just say in that crowd, "I think I'm getting a sore throat." And you watch what happens. Somebody said, "Did I ever tell you about my sore throat? Man, I had a doozy of a sore throat." And somebody else will say, "That ain't even a sore throat." Now, let me tell you about a real sore throat. Mine lasted 6 weeks. And then finally, somebody's going to say, "All I know is my doctor's been practicing medicine 45 years, and he said I had the worst case of sore throat he had ever seen or he'd ever read about in medical material." You're going to out-brag each other about how sick you are, because we have the ability to enjoy our sicknesses. I remember visiting a lady, and I had never visited her before, and I went to her house. She was an older lady, and we talked a little bit, and she said, "Preacher, you in a big hurry?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Well, I want to show you something." So she went off this way in the room, and I heard her stirring around, so I knew pretty well she's going to bring back some photographs of grandchildren. And sure enough, she came in a minute, and there was a coffee table in front of me, and she laid 3 photographs on that coffee table. She said, "I think I got another one or 2, and this time she actually did it this way. Well, while she was gone, I just leaned over and looked. I didn't rightly know what that was, but I was certain if it was a grandchild, it was in bad shape. I knew that for certain. And then she came back, and sure enough, she had 2 more. She laid 5 photographs down on that table. And then she said, "Preacher, take a good look." And I did. And she said, "You know what that is?" I said, "No, ma'am. I have no idea." And she said, "That's my gallbladder." Now, she had had her gallbladder removed and evidently hired a photographer. Because there it was, 5 photographs of her gallbladder. You all know what a gallbladder looks like? Well, I'm a country boy, and my mama raised chickens. We'd get 100 biddies in the mail. No, you don't believe that, do you? But that's the truth. We get 100 biddies in the mail. And when those little biddies got up to about 1.5 pounds or 2 pounds, they'd just right for frying. And my mama sold them. And on a Saturday, we'd kill 20 young fryers and sell them. And then we'd take some of those and let them grow into maturity and become hens, and they lay eggs. And then the older hens, we'd sell them off around Easter and holidays, Christmas, Thanksgiving. Folks would make chicken and dumplings. So when we'd sell those old hens, they'd call up my mom and say, "We want an old hen or two." So we had to catch those hens. We had to clean them, dress them. It looked like we was undressing them, but dressing's what they say it is. But you had to dip them in hot water and pull off the feathers. Now, besides the wings and the legs and the thighs, the chickens got gizzards and livers. Now, you can take the liver right out of an old hen, wash it up and fry, but you can't do that with a gizzard. If you're going to eat the gizzard, you're going to have to take your knife and slice that gizzard open and lay that gizzard down like this. Because in there is a little sack. And in that sack, it's got sand and stones and grains of corn. And you got to peel that sack with all that stuff in there and throw that away before you can clean and eat the gizzard. Well, now her gallbladder looked just exactly like a chicken gizzard, sliced open and laid back with all that stuff in that bag. I don't know how many chicken gizzards I'd sliced open, but I don't ever remember saying to my little sister, "Run, get the Polaroid," because we don't want to miss keeping this forever. But she had 5 photographs of her gallbladder, and she was proud as a peacock. I told that story one time, and the preacher's wife said to her husband, I was preaching the Bible, and she said, "You want to tell him about yours?" He said he had his on videotape. That's what he said. I remember going to St. Francis Hospital, visiting an elderly lady who was sick, and she'd been in intensive care for a couple of days, so she was really sick, I'm sure, but she'd got out into her room, and I went to see her. And she said, "Preacher, you remember Ann? My daughter-in-law lives in Nashville, Tennessee." And I said, "I remember her." She said, "Well, she's had a stroke. You need to pray for her." I said, "Well, she's mighty young." She said, "Yeah, just 51, but she's had a stroke." So anyway, 2 or 3 days later, I went back to see this lady, and she said, "Did I tell you Ann had a stroke?" And I said, "Yeah." She said, "Well, Ann passed away." And I said, "I'm sorry." And she said, "Yeah, Ann died, but she's not as sick as I am." Now, you figure that one out. She died, but she ain't as sick as I am. You know, I just said, well, I guess terminal's not as bad as it used to be. I don't know. What do you say? She didn't want anybody to be sicker than she was. We're like that. We talk about our sickness. We brag about our sickness. We enjoy our sickness. We go over and over and tell those stories over and over again. So now Jesus sees this man laying here. He's at the pool of Bethesda. But Jesus knows that this man can enjoy his infirmities. You don't have to work. Yeah. So he just asked him. He said, "Do you really want to be well?" It wasn't a foolish question. Another reason why that's not a foolish question is because Jesus knows us well enough to know that we have the ability to deceive ourselves. It's a great story in the 2nd chapter of Kings. You need to read it. It's about Naaman. Naaman was a commander in the king's army. And the king had a lot of confidence in in his army because of Naaman. And Naaman contracted leprosy. Leprosy is the worst thing that can happen to you in the Old Testament. Terrible disease where your body basically just rots. Naaman had leprosy. No cure for leprosy. Now, on one of his excursions as a soldier, he brought back a lot of things that he had confiscated, but one thing he brought back was a little teenage Israeli girl. And she was a servant to his wife. And one day his wife was having a meltdown, crying because her husband had leprosy, couldn't live at home, couldn't function as an army commander. So she was just weeping. And that little Israeli girl said to Naaman's wife, she said, "You know there is a cure for leprosy." She said, "No, there is no cure." She said, "Oh, yes. Our God, the God of Israel, can heal leprosy. There's nothing God cannot do." Well, his wife got all excited, and she said, "Really? You mean there's a chance he can be healed?" And she said, "Yes." So she couldn't wait. She got a message to Naaman and said, "Good news, there's a possibility of healing. All you got to do is ride down to Israel and find somebody there, a prophet, who can tell you about this." Naaman said, "I'm not riding down there. There's no cure for leprosy." So she told the king, "I heard there's a possible cure." So the king told Naaman, "You go, you see if you can find healing." Now, I'm not just suggesting this now. I'm your commander-in-chief. I'm ordering you to go. So now he had to go. He didn't want to go. But the Bible says that Naaman took gold and silver and fine linen that commentaries tell us was worth $80,000 in his day. So here's a man who had leprosy, incurable disease. He rides for days on camel or horseback. Gets down to Israel. The king had told him, "I'll give you a letter to take to the king and introduce you and tell him you're there for healing." He takes with him $80,000 worth of stuff to pay for healing. He gets down there. He finds the king. The king reads the letter. He thinks it's a trick because it's from another king, and this is a commander in the army. So he says, "I ain't got anything to do with this. I'm a king. I can't heal leprosy or anything else. Send him away." But the prophet Elijah heard this story. And he told the king, sent a message to the king, said, "Don't send this man away, send him to me." So they told Naaman, "You don't need to see the king, you need to see the prophet Elijah. He just lives down the road." So he rides down to Elisha's house. He sees a servant out there in the yard, and he says, "Tell Elisha, the prophet, I want to see him." So he goes in the house and he comes back out and he said, "The prophet said he don't need to see you. What you want?" And he said, "Well, I have leprosy and I've told that there might be healing." And he said, "I'll go." He went back in the house. He came back out and he said, Elisha said, "Go down to the river Jordan and dip 7 times. And Naaman was furious. He said, "Does he know who I am? Tell him to come out here personally and tell me this." And the prophet said, the servant said, he said he wasn't coming out here. But if you want to be healed, just go down to River Jordan and dip 7 times. Naaman said, "I knew this was crap when I left." You know. He said, there ain't no healing here. We got rivers back home. If it's dipping in a river, I could have done that. But he had some men with him, and his men said, "Now let's just think about this. Your wife's been on your back about this. The king ordered you to come down here. Let's just go on down here to the river. You can dip 7 times. We'll go back home, tell them it didn't work. That'll get your wife off your back, and that's worth $80,000, by the way. But that's a different sermon. And the king will be satisfied. Naaman said, that's probably a good idea. I'll just go down here and dip. So he goes down there and he dips in the River Jordan 6 times. Nothing happened. But the 7th time, he came up clean. He was healed. Naaman went back to Elisha's house, told that servant boy, he said, tell the prophet I'm healed, and here's gold and silver and fine linen to pay for it. The prophet went in the house and he came back out and he said, the prophet said, he's not surprised you're healed, but there's no charge. He didn't do it. The God of Israel did. He doesn't charge for his services. Now here's Naaman with $80,000 worth of gold, silver, and fine linen, and no leprosy. You know, the story doesn't end there. Gehazi was the name of that servant. When Naaman rode off, Gehazi said, I sure could have used some gold, some silver, and some fine linen. He said, I know what I'll do. He jumped on a horse and he took off after Naaman. Naaman saw him coming, waited on him. He rode up in a cloud of dust. Said, you hadn't any more than left the house. 3 seminary boys come by. They needed money, clothes to go to school. Elisha said, if you'd just been here sooner, I'd have got you some of that gold and silver and fine linen for some clothing. He said, I'll tell you what, Gehazi, see if you can catch him. So he said, here I am. We just need a little gold, a little silver, and a little bit of clothing for these seminary boys. Naaman said, take it all. He said, oh, no. Just enough to get these seminary boys by. So he said, take what you want. He took some silver, he took some gold. He took some fine linen. He went back to Elisha's house. He dug a hole and buried it. Well, Elisha called Gehazi in. He said, Gehazi, I know what you did. There ain't no hole deep enough to cover your sin. And then he said, I know what you did. The penalty for you stealing gold, silver, and fine linen is you will have leprosy, and so will your family. You hear that? Here's a man who had leprosy, said he was willing to pay $80,000 to be healed, and turned it down. Here's another man who is healthy, bought leprosy for himself and his family for a little gold, silver, and fine linen. Neither one of those men would ever thought they'd do such a thing, but they did. We have the ability to deceive ourselves. If you go downtown to Columbus in the morning, stop people on the street and ask them if they're going to heaven, every one of them will say yes. You know what I figured out? If everybody in Columbus goes to heaven, it won't be heaven, it'll be Columbus. You know why it's going to be heaven? Because the folks that don't belong there ain't going. See, we think every grandmother is going to heaven. It's not true. Every grandmother that knows Jesus is going to heaven. Not every grandmother. You don't go to heaven because you're a grandmother or a grandfather. You don't go to heaven because you're a good old boy. You go to heaven because Jesus has said to you, do you want me to make you whole? And you said yes to Jesus. That's the only way. Let me tell you about my grandmother. My grandmother was mean. She was always mean. I don't have time to tell you how mean she was. But she was mean. She lived to be 96 just to aggravate us. And then she got mad at us because we had to put her in a nursing home. And she said, I won't ever eat again or drink again. I'll die, make you all sad. So she didn't eat or drink, and she died, but we wasn't sad, okay? Yeah. Why would I want to spend eternity with a grandmother I didn't like on earth? I'd be there forever. She was mean. She lived mean, she died mean. And then she went to heaven. No, she didn't. I don't want to stand here and tell you that I enjoy saying my grandmother ain't got any chance to be in heaven. But I don't want to think she's there either because, it's eternity and I'd have to be with her. So we deceive ourselves. Everybody ain't going. Chances are everybody in this room ain't going. So Jesus is saying to you, you really want me to work you over, make you clean, heal you, mind, body, soul, spirit? Or are you just deceiving yourself? And then the third reason is Jesus knows that we have the ability to deceive one another. If Matt was here this morning, he'd know this church, I'm sure, but a few years ago, I went to preach a revival in a church, and it's one of those churches that has revival every year at the same time. It has to do with the third full moon in August or something, and second Sunday after that or whatever. But always that third Sunday in August, they have homecoming in the morning, start revival on that night. So they asked me to go over there and preach revival. I like to get there early and walk the grounds and pray inside the sanctuary. So I pulled up there early, an hour before the service. There was one pickup truck in the driveway. So I go in, there's a young man in there. And he tells me his name, and he said, you must be the guy that's going to preach this week. And I said, yes. He said, I want to tell you, I am so mad I could spit nails. And I said, what's wrong? He said, well, where I work, there's a lot of people on vacation, and they've put me on the evening shift this week, and this is the only night I get to come to revival. I'm mad. I said, well, man's got to work. So he was at church that night, and then that was it. He had to work. For some reason, they asked me back the very next year to preach, so it was a year later. Same time, same frame, everything. So I pull into the parking lot, and there's one pickup in the parking lot. I recognize it. Same pickup truck. So I go in. He said, you don't remember me? I said, oh, yes, I do. You was really mad last year. He said, I want you to know I told them where I work. If they do that to me this year, I quit. I'm not missing revival. My mom and dad are driving 75 miles one way tonight to come to church. I've asked the preacher if I could lead the singing. He said yes. He said, tomorrow night my brother's going to come and sing, and Tuesday night my friend's coming to give a testimony. And I said to myself, now this man's going to be blessed to the hilt. He's waited a whole year to be here. Got his brother coming, his parents coming. God's going to bless the socks off this man. Well, we had church. He led the singing. He couldn't lead nor sing. But that doesn't matter. It's not what it's about. But I preached. When I got through preaching, one woman came down the aisle, and she knelt right where these steps are. And she began to weep like I've never seen anybody weep. She was weeping so hard that she was shaking the platform that I was standing on. So I got down there, and I knelt down beside her. And I said, what in the world is your trouble? And she said, preacher, everything is wrong in my life. Our home is a hell. I can't think of anything that's right. That was his wife. His brother came the next night and sang. A guy came Tuesday and gave his testimony. But he wasn't there. Neither was his family. He fooled me. He fooled me. We can fool each other. Do you know everybody comes to church don't want to quit singing? Everybody don't want to quit sinning. Some of you like it. Just because you're here this morning don't mean you want to quit. Just because you're here this morning didn't mean that you got up this morning saying, I'm going to go to church and let Jesus make me whole. Some of you found out this is the safest place to hide. If you don't go to church, folks will bug you about it. They'll invite you and say, you ought to come to the fort. Worship's great. Preaching's good. People are friendly. You ought to come to the fort. If you don't come, they'll call you up next week and ask you again. They'll even pray for you. Get saved. But if you just come, sit in the back, they'll leave you alone. Quit calling you, quit praying for you. Safest place there, did I tell you a secret? Did I let the cat out? Or some of you already know that. This is a safe place to hide. You're not wanting to be whole. You're just getting folks off your back. So you see, Jesus knows that. So here's this guy. He's at the healing pool. He is crippled. But Jesus knows that. Let's just talk about this guy for a minute. If this man stayed at home all day, laid on the sofa, watched soap operas, and drew disability, people would say, now there's a sorry man right there. There's a healing pool right down the road. He won't even go down there. He's just sorry to the bone. But if he picks up his pallet every day, goes down there with his iPad, lays down there in the sun, folks are going to say, bless his heart. He wants to be healed so bad and can't be. Not necessarily so. He's just fooling folks. Just fooling folks. So Jesus asked an important question. See, we're about to go into a new year. Jesus is saying this morning, you're going to be in 2016 just like you are in 2015. Because you don't want to be changed. You don't want to be. You enjoy things the way they are too much. Or you're deceiving yourselves. Or you're deceiving each other. Just faking it. You don't want to really be whole. Now, I could ask you this morning by a show of hands, how many want to be made whole? But that ain't going to do any good. The only way to know for sure is I'm not going anyplace. I've been in Columbus 34 years. I'm going to hang around. I know Matt well. I know Justin. I'm going to ask him, are those folks letting Jesus make them whole? Because that's the only way to know for sure. Now, this man told Jesus when he asked him that, do you want to be whole? He said, I can't. Because the first person only in the water is healed, and I'm too slow. But Jesus said, I didn't ask you, can you be healed? I ask you, do you want to be? I can do it. I don't care what's wrong with you this morning. It can be the longest night of the year problem, loneliness. I don't care what it is. Jesus can make you whole this morning. He can do it. The question is, do you want him to? Do you want to be made whole? Father.